Welcome to Driven. I'm your host, Paul Perrone. We're going to learn and talk about AI, robotics, autonomous vehicles, and so much more. Check us out at driven.show on the web and give us a thumbs up or subscribe here if you like the show. So kick back or buckle up and become driven.
Chunka, it's so great to see you again. Thank you for doing this.
Yeah, hey, thanks for having me.
It's been a while. I first got exposed and enraptured by your writing back in, I think it was 2013, when you first wrote an article about driverless cars. I was in the early stages of being in that domain myself, and you wrote these wonderful articles for, I think it was Forbes, and then you wrote a book which I read religiously, and then since then I followed a lot of what you've been doing. You're a futurist, an innovation strategy advisor, best-selling author of like 5 books and hundreds of articles. So thank you for taking the time to be here on Driven, which is all about AI, robotics, and autonomous vehicles, which is just really a subset of really probably what you focus on these days, but certainly a key thing that you've covered in the past.
Yes, well, thanks for having me. And I'll warn you that, most of the reason I'm here is because I want to get your expertise and your knowledge about this field. So don't be surprised if I don't have an answer to your question, but I ask you instead.
Oh, well, hey, it's all about a conversation. I think the more, natural these conversations go, the better. I picked up your most recent book, A Brief History of the Perfect Future, Inventing the World We Can Proudly Leave for Our Kids by 2050, which I just thought was a great title. It's sort of just that title itself drew me in. But I was wondering if you could share a little bit about, your journey into becoming like a futurist. How does one become a futurist, as the title is, right? And
Yes.
an innovation advisor. How does one go from what you've studied, computer engineering back in the day, and all the things that you've done to sort of adopting this new sort of profession, so to speak.
Well, I'll let me claim a lot of humility about the term. It's more of a term given to me than the one I've taken, but it does represent the fact that I've been steeped in a lot of advanced technologies over the course of my career, and what I really worry about these days is how they impact our future and how we can harness them to create the kind of futures that we want. Because some people call me a techno optimist, but I don't actually claim that term. I think of technology as an amplifier, and it's an amplifier of both good and bad. Good intentions and bad intentions are inadvertent, eventualities. So I worry a lot about the future, and I worry a lot about how we use all these powerful tools that we have.
Yeah, that's a very practical viewpoint. Obviously, I'm clearly, being in this space, I'm a optimist myself, but you definitely see the negative ramifications of the technologies as applied, of course. Um, One of the things that I thought was interesting in your most recent book, Brief History of a Perfect Future, is you provide some historical information and reasoning for why the number zero is important, and has special meaning in sort of human history. And I just thought it'd be interesting to start out for you to describe why that special number, the number zero, is so important, and really what it means in the context of sort of predicting the future.
Sure. I mean, for those of us in this space, both from our experience and from how we think about the world, the notion of an exponential curve in terms of increase in technology capability, I mean, that's common in our language. And it was actually my co-author for Perfect Future, Paul Carroll, who said, let's turn that around a little bit. Instead of talking about exponential increase in capability, what we really have is an exponential decrease in costs, per unit cost for these capabilities. And if you think about it in the long term, what we have is essentially, we have capabilities going like this, but what we also have is costs going down like that. So you think about Moore's law, the rapid rise in computing capability also brings with it a rapid decrease in the cost of computing. So if we think about those advanced technologies as tools, we can ride that curve to assume that the cost for whatever we're using is going to decrease dramatically, approaching zero. It'll never get to zero, but on a relative basis, it sure feels like zero. So when we talk about exponential technologies in the book, we're really talking about a drive towards a marginal cost of almost zero. And if you think that way, you have a whole different perspective on what the future can bring, and what you can build if you think about it in that long term.
That is interesting. In mathematical terms, I guess that's kind of like the singularity divided by itself, right? Like one over infinity is zero, right?
Yeah,
So with the
yeah, I
exponential curve and the path to infinity, so you're looking at it from this different perspective, and that it's going to drive costs of processing, energy, whatever, to zero. It sounds like.
yeah. And what it tells you is that that large quantitative change in cost can lead it to really qualitative differences in what you build. And the example we talk about in the book, and comes from personal experience of a very good friend of mine, Alan Kay, is that when Alan Kay in the 1960s read Gordon Moore's paper about Moore's law, essentially, he was a graduate student, and he looked at it and he didn't say, "Wow, we can build really great mainframes." At that declining cost, he said, "Wow, it fundamentally changes the nature of computers, and we can imagine that every child can have a computer, right?"
The Dynabook.
Right.
Yeah,
So what does that look like?
yeah,
So, if you look at all his work on the Dynabook and object-oriented programming and graphical user interfaces, it was all built on the assumption that by the time he finished the software, the hardware would be there, right? So,
interesting.
so you could have a whole different paradigm in terms of the kinds of tools that you're building, and you can, if you have a large enough time frame, build towards that. And that's essentially the core message of the book, which is, imagine the great capabilities you're going to have over 15, 30 years. What kind of world do we want to get ready for and build, using those kinds of capabilities, as opposed to just sort of letting them happen inadvertently?
Right, right. Knowing where the trends are going, such that you can leverage,
Yeah,
um, use them, be prepared for them, adapt.
right.
Exactly.
In a very sort of engineering sort of way, knowing where the trends are going, as opposed to just sort of saying, everything's possible, imagining it, but building based on science as opposed to just fantasy.
Right, right. The difference between science fiction and science
Yeah,
projection.
I love science fiction, but
Yeah,
hard science fiction is more interesting.
hard science fiction. Right, right. I'm reading Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy with my 13-year-old son for the first time. So
Yes,
it's fun to watch sort of this exposure to sci-fi and just sort of a different way of thinking. So it's always been influential to a lot of engineers and technologists, sci-fi, I think. And but certainly with what we do, we have to think about more realistic things. Yes, the Terminator could happen, but we're thinking about more positive things in the robotic space and the applications for robotics, right?
yeah,
So,
absolutely, absolutely.
and to know that robotics, for example, is of course becoming more and more uh, economically viable due to this drive to zero for processing power. You can get more mobility on a platform that you historically had to be on a large server sitting in a corner, um, and taking advantage and leveraging that, knowing that that's really leading to a massive growth in robotics, I think. And be interested to hear what you think about robotics in a moment. But I did want to not lose track for my train of thought on the book, because you also talk about, and I thought it was a very interesting way to approach this, future histories, as you call them, as a way to describe what the world might look like in terms of news stories of the future.
Yeah,
Can you just kind of comment on sort of why that approach to discussing the future?
yeah. So one of the things when people think about futurists, they think that we're predicting the future, right? And my point is always, no, I'm not predicting the future. I'm articulating the future we could have if we did the right things. Um, because oftentimes the easiest way to predict the future is to extrapolate from all the current circumstances, and you'll probably be right. But that might not be the future you actually want. If, for example, you look at climate change and you sort of extrapolate from a lot of the data, that's not a future we want.
Right.
So how do you actually get to a future you actually want? Well, one way to doing it is sort of in a rigorous, sort of pragmatic way, is articulate that goal and then work backwards today and ask yourself, okay, what do you have to do today in order to get to that goal, and what are the milestones over time? And future histories are really sort of an articulation of the desired future, right? And it comes from Alan Kay's sort of aphorism that says the best way to predict a future is to invent it, which means you articulate the one you want and then work back today and start working towards that. So future history is our way of sort of saying, if we were describing, or if an outsider was describing, a journalist, for example, was describing the kind of future that a scientist like you wants to build, how would they describe that to the layman? And how can they do that in a way that excites all the various stakeholders to actually work towards that future? So we start with a story, essentially. Future history is a story about the desired future.
Yeah, I thought that was it's a great way to describe the future, and another reason why the book is definitely worth reading, and it was very enjoyable. I personally enjoyed
Appreciate
reading
that,
it.
Paul.
I think that was one of your. I know you've had a couple others before that, but that was probably your last publication, or
Yeah, that
most
was my
recent, I
last
should
book.
say. Well, I know you've certainly studied more than, and you've looked at more than just transportation and driverless vehicles. But as I mentioned at the start of this podcast, that's how I came to become aware of you, because that's what I've been doing for the last 20 years. And I think it was 2013 you published a series of articles about driverless cars, and the $1 trillion market opportunity for Google, and it was fascinating and in many ways spot on. But I wanted to see what your take was now that 10 years have passed. What has occurred in the autonomy space that maybe exceeded what you expected, or maybe surprised you as, say, this was totally unexpected?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you the story about how I got interested in the topic, and that'll relate to sort of where I think about it now. It was I was sitting in the computer museum in Silicon Valley with Mike Hawley, who was professor at MIT at the time. And Mike was a guy who just knew everything that was going on. At the time, he was on the board of Kodak, so he was both in the sort of traditional space and the new space. I said, Mike, what's the most exciting thing going on around here? And he said, driverless cars. And I think this was like 2011, 2012. It was really before most of us heard about it. And I have a computer science background, as you said. I went to MIT, but I'm no Mike Hawley. When Mike Hawley said something was really interesting, I knew that it had a really rigorous technical basis behind it. So I started thinking about it, and I said to myself, wow, what if he's right? And I was sitting at home one night and I started doing the math about, okay, what happens if you actually build this damn thing, if that autonomous
Right.
vehicle actually works? One thing is, wow, we spend about $200 billion a year just in the US on auto insurance because of the possibility that you're going to have a crash, whether it's
Mhm.
personal liability and we have to spend that. It's sort of mandated in almost all the states. What happens to that? Wow, that goes away. What happens to insurance companies? Well, you got hundreds of thousands of people in call centers taking calls for accidents. I said, and I sort of started working backwards or working in both directions. At that point in time, the, the tier one um, supplier market was about $250 billion. We had about $300 billion in new car sales and another couple $100 billion in used car sales. And then we had all the fuel and the body shops and the auto repair industries and the car rental places and ER visits due to accidents. And I did a rough back of the envelope calculation, and I said, wow. In the U.S. alone, we spend about $3.5 trillion a year based on the nature of that core automobile. If it changes, if it changes to be autonomous and therefore also electric and also shared, what happens to to the to the to the suppliers? What happens to the OEMs? What happens to the new car dealers? What happens to insurance? What happens to fuel? What happens to all the stuff down the value chain? And that's where we got the $1 trillion number. I mean, a lot of people thought that I was talking about, and that's my mistake. I was talking about the opportunity for Google. I was talking about sort of the trillions of dollars that go up for grabs as long as you have sort of these fundamental changes in all the pieces of the value chain because you've changed the nature of that core piece.
Hmm.
It doesn't go away, but it might shift, or how you capture that particular part, might be different. And
Yeah.
even if you had, let's say you have 50% penetration or even 25% penetration, right, of autonomous vehicles, that still changes everything because it changes the growth curves, it changes the investment levels, everything else. That's why I thought it was so disruptive. And in a way, it still is, but certainly it's taking a lot longer than many people forecasted. Um, but I think, if you take away the desire, the 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 exuberance in the beginning and look at the advances that you and your colleagues have made in this technology, it is you're looking. If we had been sitting here in 2005 looking at what you can do today, we would have thought it'd be magical. Right?
Hmm.
There's no way they can do that. But I think we're also learning that core technology has to embed itself into a legacy system, a legacy transportation system. Um, and that embedding is very complex. That interaction is very complex. And the most difficult problem of all, which some people have talked about, but still is not talked enough about today, is that even if you get everything right in the car, you still have to deal with the legacy drivers,
Yeah.
the humans. And I don't think that anybody really has a good theory for prediction of what a human driver or human pedestrian or human cyclist outside the car will do. And certainly it's very good, but maybe not at the level that we need it to be. So I think that's the hardest problem right now. But I think if you look over the long term, as I was talking about before, in the 15, 20 year time frame, you're going to have massive disruption across so many different sectors of the economy because of this fundamental technology change.
Yeah. No, that's of course, I agree in many ways because I'm involved in the space. But it's funny. I sometimes say that I think it's the world's hardest problem. It's harder than rocket science and brain surgery, more difficult, more complex because you're building this brain that drives a vehicle, and you're on the ground where there's, instead of in space or in the air, where there's people and everything, cars and all kinds of different environments. And we're seeing the unfortunate manifestation of these unexpected events, or as they might call them, long tail or edge cases, like we saw with Cruise in San Francisco recently. Another human driven vehicle hit a pedestrian, which and projected the pedestrian in front of the cruise vehicle, which then it applied the brakes, but it ran over the individual,
Yeah,
and then it pulled over to the side of the road, making matters worse, right? Because
right.
the individual was still on the ground, and those you got to imagine that that's a very difficult scenario to think about when you're designing these vehicles,
Yeah,
especially when you're
right.
focused on so many other the core functions, right, that have to happen.
Yeah, it was a tragic one in I don't know how many hundreds of millions of chances. But as they say, with great power comes great responsibility.
Hmm.
You're not just building. You're not just one driver driving one car. You're programming potentially millions of these things. So it has to, it has to work in almost any case imaginable. Now we could argue about, or we could talk about whether or not that's the right criteria to put on the technology. But I certainly would have that as a starting point, and then be very careful about how we relax those constraints.
Are you surprised by the current sort of market situation with autonomous vehicles right now? I mean, Uber has sort of come and gone to some extent in the market. Argo was a big investment from Ford and VW. Cruise has had some troubles, and it's, as a practitioner, again, I know how complicated this is, and especially, trying to build a business around it. It's very complicated. Um, but what do you make of sort of where the industry is at from, economically, and maybe casting it in terms of the Gartner hype cycle? I mean, there was definitely a peak. Maybe it was 2016, 17. I don't know when it was, but then, we're definitely not in the peak in industry, the peak of enlightenment, or whatever they might call it. And I don't think we're quite in the trial of disillusionment or trough of disillusionment. But but I don't know, where do you think we are, and are you surprised by you know that we haven't gotten farther at this point, given sort of some of the promises and projections, not from technologists, but from the companies building this technology themselves?
Yeah, I'm disappointed but not surprised. I think that you know the hype cycle is most relevant to quick twitch day traders and the people they influence, right? So the challenge was always that this technology was going to be very hard to build, was going to be very expensive, and the question, actually, I asked one of my clients years ago this question: are you building this technology to learn about something that will fundamentally change your industry in the 5 to 10 year time frame, or are you building it to release next year, right? And pursuing the technology essentially as a business option, right? And developing it to the point where when it's ready, you can scale really fast, or building it under the assumption you're going to scale tomorrow. Those are radically different investment profiles. And with something as complex as this, embedding into the large scale systems that we're embedding into, the latter approach of scaling as fast as you can is really, really risky.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I mean, the nature of venture capital and the nature of most corporate investment schemes is very short term. So even executives who believe in the technology in the long term essentially oftentimes have to use their political capital and act as if it's a short term play. And balancing those two is the challenge. So you're going to have a lot of, I mean, you're going to have to work two ways. Right? One is you have to have a lot of long term patience while fending off the alligators and not go overboard, but put enough to still be played. Or as I think your company strategy is, you focus on narrow domains, problem domains, and gradually build up.
Right.
Right? You know, Balancing those two is really hard. And from a societal point of view, the good thing is that even if a lot of money is lost in the short term, a lot of technology we built, and that money will be recouped, on an industry level over time. So
Right.
you're making bets. You're making bets.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think any company in 2013 or 14 or 16, if they said it's going to be another 15 to 20 years before we have this fully autonomous automotive solution, they wouldn't have gotten a dime of investment. In
Well, I
many
think
ways,
they would
I
have
mean,
gotten. They would have gotten. It was worth. We make a point in one of our earlier books that initial investment that Google made in a self-driving car project uh, in those first couple of years was about how much it would cost to design a new bumper,
Yeah.
design and put in production a new bumper. I mean, we're talking about massive amounts of market value. So you can invest a lot in that industry, in your industry, you know, without going crazy. And of course, it helps if you're Larry Page and have access to essentially all the money in the world, where you can play long term options. And I think that one of the things that Google did in the beginning, through its moonshot factory, was to treat many of these things as if they were options that they were investing in and developing over time, and that's why they kill most of the projects at Google X, and only a few sort of made it to this level.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess I wasn't really thinking so much of Google, but of all the other, companies that went out and sought venture backing, right? Especially in the early
Yes.
days. But yeah, Google, very good point. Didn't really think about it like that in terms of how they're structured. Probably Apple the same way, I assume. And and I imagine, automotive companies, some have gotten seemingly tired of trying, and sort of, given up, or they've tried to acquire. And but I think it comes down to that there's the technology, and then there's the business model. And there are, as you touched upon, so many applications now where you can go autonomous, right? Defined, bounded geofence zones, logistics, shuttles, campuses, things like that, right? And other domains, uh, that, I guess, do you what are your thoughts on sort of those market opportunities? That they're not as big as sort of the automotive market, where you're going to sell 100,000, vehicles or something with this technology inside. But they're something. and
Yeah,
um, and I guess, agriculture is different from trucking, is different from transit, right? In terms of the
yeah.
market opportunity.
Well, I think if we look back 15 years from now, that's how this technology will mature. It will be a series of more closed problem domains where we learn, develop over time, um, evolving to, or maybe financing the continued development of more general purpose transportation. But some of those markets are massive, right? If you look at trucking, right, which has a lot less complicated sort of interaction with humans, certainly very few pedestrians, cyclists, all of that, and a infrastructure, sort of a supply and logistics infrastructure that has to change, but not doesn't have to change as dramatically. I mean, that's the core part of an $800 billion business. So, even if you look at trucking from the standpoint that, well, a lot of the new entrants have looked at it saying, hey, what if I stay on the highways just within Texas, right, and avoid the interstate commerce, federal regulations, and use it as a testing ground? That's still a very fertile ground for testing, and then
Hmm.
you get to develop. So I think from a long view standpoint, that's how this is going to evolve, and some of those markets will be big enough to be sustainable, for players who focus on it, and over time we'll develop more and more of both the technology and the awareness and all the regulatory stuff that has to follow to allow for more general purpose use.
Hmm.
But even if you look at the Uber like ride sharing kind of services, that's essentially how that's evolving as well, right? Small geofence domains expanding over time. The pace of expansion, right, it varies.
Hmm.
The complexity of those problems are still sort of grappling with. As you talked about earlier, we have some companies that are going really, really fast and having some challenges. But other companies are going really fast or just as fast and not having as much challenges. Right. So there's a lot of learning, there's a lot of competition in this space.
Yeah. Yeah, and then not just in the private sector, but in the public sector for public transit. Um, how do you, any thought to the evolution of this technology for urban planning, daily commutes, public transit type applications, and impediments that you see as well along the way in that area, or
Yeah.
or just opportunities?
It's funny. I was accused recently, um, by another friend of mine, a different MIT professor who I won't name, as being I think he wrote something like, Chunka Mui has been a proponent for, autonomous vehicles forever. What does he have to say now? And my response was, no, I was a proponent for the benefits of autonomous transportation, right? And I want it to be I want it to be safe and workable in order to get those benefits. I'm not arguing that I'm not the technologist who are making predictions from a technology standpoint. But I mean, just back to your question. I mean, transportation is sort of a fundamental factor to quality of life, economic opportunity, right? If you can't get to where you need to go for your job, you can't have that job,
Right.
right? And if you're blind, if you're old, if you're disabled in some way, you can't move around, your quality of life and your health decreases dramatically. So if we can drive down the cost for transportation and make it safe and easily accessible, that's phenomenal. So that is literally sort of the mandate for public transportation, right? To provide accessible transportation. This is a technology that allows us to do that, and you have to find the right problem domains. But if you're someone in a large city who relies on paratransit, service is awful. It takes you days, hours, to get it, and the vehicles are poor. Even in some big cities, we subsidize the cost of public transportation, way beyond what the fare box gives us. So we could drive that cost down with more affordable autonomous transportation and increase access to transportation. So
Yeah.
those benefits are definitely worth worrying about and thinking about and building towards. And I think that's the opportunity that a lot of governmental agencies worry about sort of the downside, and I think they need to embrace the upside and figure out how to get there, as quickly as possible.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things I wanted to share a little bit about is in looking at some of these specific industry applications for autonomy, be it transit, logistics, agriculture, as an autonomy sort of technologist company or what have you, we're thinking of we've made an autonomous driver. We're going to put it in the vehicle and it's going to drive a vehicle. But then there's all these other things that can happen outside of that vehicle that maybe that driver did that we technologists don't always think of. For example, in transit, you have a driver there driving the bus or the vehicle, and but sometimes they're helping people get on and off the the vehicle, right? Folks who need help with the wheelchair lift, or other services that they may be providing. If someone has a medical issue in the vehicle, there's somebody there. You can't necessarily just take the driver out of the seat. That driver may become more of a different type of service provider and still be there. So the return on investment, quote unquote, for if there is an economic reason for that, is sort of goes away to some extent, or is not as strong of a case. In logistics, with yard trucks that might be pulling tractor trailers around a yard, you think, oh, it's an easy thing, it's a defined zone. But then you have what are called the glad hands, that you connect the trailer to the yard truck to these hoses, right? That have to be disconnected and connected, and the driver does that. And so now you have to create a whole robotic contraption or a new mechanism to deal with that. So you can't just automate the truck. You have to also deal with that problem.
Yeah.
And I think autonomy companies encounter these situations along the way, right? When they're not as familiar with the domain and the other things that people do outside of just driving the vehicle, right?
Right.
That
Absolutely. There's a
yeah,
whole business design on top of the, let's say that the vehicle itself was perfect, right? Um, in all edge cases. Even if you had that, there's a whole business design around that, including the kinds of capabilities that you're talking about, which makes it still a really hard problem, right? Addressable in some cases and not addressable in others. I remember in the early days, um, I was getting into an Uber in San Francisco, and I was during a trip. I had my kids with me, and we went to the beach. And then I called an Uber to take us back from the beach. And as we're getting into the Uber, I'm looking at my kids, and they're like full of sand. They're wet, and I said to the driver, "I'm really sorry. I'm really sorry about this, right?" And he said, "Don't worry about it. I'll clean it up." Well, if you have a driverless
right,
car, nobody cleans it up, and people do a lot worse than putting sand in the car. So it's like, and I said this to another client at one point when we were sort of analyzing their business model on top of a vehicle. I said, you're essentially building potentially millions of hotel rooms on wheels with no front desk, with no security, with no concierge, right? How are you going to handle that kind of a business, right? You go from thinking about cars to a short cycle customer service oriented business where you're managing all these disparate assets,
yeah,
right? So the load balancing, the maintenance, all that kind of stuff. All that stuff was way beyond what any sort of AV focused development, either organization, group inside a company or a startup, has any sense of. I mean, that it's unfair to ask them to answer that question in the beginning, but they have to answer that question before they can scale a real business.
right. Before it becomes a practical solution. That's right.
And I know you're working in more limited domains, but I'm sure you're dealing with the same thing, right? Okay, we got this thing, it works, but how does it, now I have a hybrid model. What's the right interaction for that? How do I oversee the fleet? How do I manage the fleet? How do I deal with inadvertent situations that I didn't predict?
Right,
Uh, do I just stop or do I pull over? Right. That was the cruise problem. Right. Can I look under the car and see that there's somebody there? You
right,
know. Um, you know. How much would that have been in March? In terms of incremental cost of sensors, not much, but they didn't think to put one down there,
right.
or they rejected the idea of putting one down there early on. But they're all going to put them in now. Now.
Yeah, I mean, or just well, it's easy to say just fail stop. You can't fail stop on a, a high speed highway,
Right. Exactly.
but
Exactly.
maybe in some of these geofence applications you can, and
Yeah.
and and
But you have to make that decision.
mhm.
Right? You have to make that. You have to imagine those possibilities. Um, you know, the easiest way to avoid accidents is not to hit the thing in front of you, right? But that
Right,
doesn't stop the guy from behind you hitting you.
that's right. Yeah, and then making all of this economical, right? If you have to add in all these extra things, I mean, what is your what is the return on investment for a customer to even buy or use this technology? And I know in the agriculture space it can be difficult because it's a great application for autonomy, wide open fields and what have you, but the margins are very tight, right, in
Right.
agriculture. So
Yeah. Same in
unless you're
trucking. Right. Same in long haul trucking.
yeah, yeah, well, yeah, trucking is, and then trucking and some of these, then they think about, well, what's the added liability, and yeah, it's so just thinking in terms of the overall business model from soup to nuts, I think has become very important for autonomy companies than
Yeah.
just obviously the technology solution. And maybe that's always been assumed to be the case, but I think, from what I've seen over the last 10 years at least, there were companies that, came and went because that wasn't always considered. And we ourselves, I've had to pivot. I don't know how many pivots I've done over the years, but to adapt to these things that you discover along the way when you try to just drop autonomy into a vehicle, there's a bunch of
Right.
other things that have to happen.
Well, you're
Um,
working on the fundamental piece, and without that, nothing else matters.
right.
But you know, in order for a business to succeed, you got to get everything right. But it only takes a few failure points to sink you. But that's the opportunity that once you have the core capability that you have the opportunity to sort of move into the right spaces, make the right partners, things of that sort.
Yes, I think the partnerships and the strategic relationships are a key part of that. So in the switching gears a little bit, just thinking more broadly about AI and maybe robotics. Um, any interesting developments that you've witnessed recently?
You mean other than generative AI?
Oh, I don't know. Just that's one topic.
Yeah. Oh, I think we have. It's just so marvelous. I mean, if you want to be a geek like me, a wannabe engineer, you look around the world and you sort of say, look at the marvelous tools that we're building, the marvelous capabilities. I mean, you look in transportation, you look at computing, communications. This is what our book is about: transportation, genomics. Wow, AI. We're just building these amazing, amazing tools, and the question is, what are we going to do with them? And how do we over the long term, as the old saying, not overestimated in the short term, but underestimated and not underestimated in the long term. How do we sort of aim for those long term benefits in a more direct way and in a more market efficient way? And there's a lot of sort of dysfunctionalities in the way that we, you know, especially in a very Silicon Valley centered world, drive towards innovation. It's very messy, but it tends, tends to work. So, what am I seeing that's marvelous? We just got first um, approved treatment for sickle cell anemia, based on genetic editing. Wow. Sickle cell affects how many, millions of people around the world, and a therapeutic was created based on uh, CRISPR, right?
Wow.
And the advances in genomic editing. What does that say for the future of medicine? It doesn't solve everything, but we can start sort of attacking single gene ailments, and over time understand more and more. That's marvelous. We've seen the progress in renewable energy. Amazing, cost curves of solar and wind, and going down, going down towards zero,
Yeah.
right? So I think we have these amazing, amazing tools, in the face of really hairy, nutty, challenging, societal issues, and the opportunity to address them. But
Yeah.
only an opportunity, not. It's not a, you know, it's not a done deal.
That's right. Now, AI, and generative AI is is obviously been particularly interesting and a hot topic. Um, I guess, how do you sort of envision that in particular, um, changing lives and the world, if in some of the different ways that you've been thinking it might be applied
Yeah,
positively and maybe negatively
yeah.
in the next 5 to 10 years.
I forgot who said it. The quote says, "The thing about generative AI and GPT is that it's now always the smartest person in the room and the dumbest person in the room, right? And it doesn't know which one it is.
Right.
with any particular response. And I think it's amazing that it can be the smartest person in the room on things that it's actually trained on. And I think it's mind-boggling that it has no sense of semantics or truth. Um, but I look at the upside and say, wow, you know, it can be really, really powerful. Let's not misuse it. You know, let's not let it do stupid things and over rely on it. But it's so early in the game, right? It's so early in the game. You know, if we can marry up the power of neural networks and large language models with all the work that we've done in semantic theory, truth maintenance, real theory of the mind. And right now they're sort of really disparate worlds with very little overlap, but they're two bodies of research, right? That I'm really hoping that we can find some way of bringing together. But the one thing that I get really annoyed about is the argument about whether or not we're dealing with intelligence or not. And I think that's a distraction, right? Because in the foreseeable future, the question is, what kind of tool can it be? How can we use it as an amplifier of human ingenuity as opposed to arguing about whether or not it will be a replacement for human ingenuity?
Right. Right. It's definitely a great co-pilot for certain activities. Um, and from a programming perspective, right, as a programmer, and in terms of grievances or things that annoy myself, I mean, one of the things has been, and maybe it's just because it's so available to everybody, which is great, but like some of the coverage of, oh well, if you ask it this thing, it gives you this. If you ask it this philosophical question or this socioeconomic question, it gives you this answer that is wrong or is right. And I'm like, well, that might not be the best use of the tool, right?
Right, right,
maybe it's really great at producing maybe like a press release or or producing or helping at least the structure of something, or you can it's really great at producing code, I think, when it's used the right way. And so there are these really tremendous productive uses of the tool
right,
that I don't think, I don't hear a lot of people talking about, because they get more wrapped around the axle with these asking it these broad questions that maybe it's not perfectly designed to do, because all it's doing is mimicking what has been out there on the web, right, in many
yeah,
ways.
that's right.
and
It's
and
it's
that's
parroting
all it's doing.
back.
Yeah.
It's parroting back. It's a predictive model that parrots back what it learned. But on the plus side, it's learned a lot more than I ever will, and parroting back things that I would have learned. But somehow I have to have the ability to differentiate, and I don't, and I have to be humble enough to know that I sometimes might not be. So I have to be even more rigorous. And the thing I worry about is when people if we develop a habit of over relying on it. But I
Right.
do think it's amazing. I have just in my geek time, I've just finished building a custom GPT for my book.
Mm.
Right, finish is the wrong word. I call it version point one. But you can go in and you can chat with the book. You can ask it about concepts in the book. You can ask it things like, "Hey, if you were a AP English teacher, how would you create an assignment around this chapter?" And that's not something that's in my book, but it's in its knowledge base,
Oh, that's
right? In its
fascinating.
learning base, and it spits out something I would have imagined because I've never been an AP English teacher. And then I can say, well, if you were a cynical AP English student, how would you do this assignment? And it spits out an answer, right? A model answer to the assignment that I didn't know about, from a perspective that I couldn't have put myself in. And it's really fun when you say, okay, make it a snide, cynical high school student. What would they say? It's just, there's all different ways of looking at a body of work from different angles. Now, would my AP English teacher, Father Wisniewski, back in at St. Ignatius College Prep in Chicago, accepted that assignment? No, he was. This is bullshit. This is junk. What is this, right? But it's a damn good start.
Yeah. That is so interesting. A lot of people don't realize that you fed the entire contents of the text of your book into whatever commercial tool you used, and it just, I assume, a cloud-based tool online, and then it learned what was in the context of your book in conjunction with all the other material that's on the web,
Right.
right?
And with along with instructions for how I wanted to use that information, what kind of tone I wanted to make, what kind of questions I wanted to answer, what kind of questions I didn't want it to answer.
Okay.
So I could say, if the interaction strays outside of the concepts and themes of my book, just tell the person, hey, I'm not trained for that.
Right.
Now it doesn't always get that right, but it tries to do that.
Oh, that's interesting.
And then it just goes off. Wow. And I think there's an example of, and this is, you might have seen, I've been sort of playing around with, I talk about, um, I've written about AI sort of in a competitive, strategic, industrial sort of perspective from various industries. I've worked a lot in insurance. I've, talked to insurance companies about how they need to approach it. But I've also said, well, how might this stuff affect my core creative process, right? Which is writing. And how do I sort of layer it on top of the stuff I've done? And how do I, so I've used it to create, I don't know, avatar narrations
Hmm.
of parts of my book. I've used it to do promo highlight, videos. And now I'm sort of building the thing focused on the book itself to be sort of the next layer of conversation, right? With that a reader could have with, I'm not claiming it's a conversation with me, but it's certainly a more robust conversation than they could have otherwise. So that's where I'm playing.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating. It kind of, I always think back to my early gaming days with the Infocom games, like Zork, where the interactive fiction, and it's almost like it's a I don't know, it's not quite that, but it's an version of that. You fed the book in, now you can just ask it questions, and
Yeah,
that's really fascinating.
yeah,
I'd
and
love to
it's
see that.
we have a lot more to do in terms of
Yeah.
sort of how to structure the book in a way that's most usable for from a training standpoint, and how to sort of frame the questions. But it's another one of those things. Wow, as you said, I mean, if I had imagined this 20 years ago and said it's, that could literally have a semi-smart tutor, right, about the contents of my book, interacting with readers, I would say, wow, give me that right now. And that's generally how I think about this technology. I look back, the first the first system I worked on after I left school, I was in the artificial intelligence group of Arthur Anderson and Company, which became Accenture. And my first assignment was to work on a system for the SEC, a prototype system where where the system had to read natural language, had to read filings, 10Ks, 10Qs, things of that sort, and try to understand it enough to sort of pull out concepts from it. We had to build a parser, we had to build the ability to read tables that were in text form. We had to sort of pull out concepts like, one of the things we looked for was, are there provisions in the proxy that are really, really oriented towards anti-takeover provisions, poison pills, supermajority rules. And of course, you had the smartest lawyers in the world trying to hide that, right? So and we had to find those concepts. Oh my God, I bet you I could put that in to one of these GPTs, and that's be like, a side effect of what it's capable of. That nobody ever thought about it, but I could say I could answer all the questions that we spend, months sort of building a system from scratch, an AI system from scratch, to try to
Yeah.
do. And now it just comes, right? It just comes if we can imagine it.
It's amazing. I mean, what do you think is going to happen though when organizations and people realize? I mean, we're loading information to the cloud, to some third party system, And I guess we don't always know how that system is. I mean, is it going to use, in your case, it's copyrighted material, but is it going to use information? It might be proprietary information that a company gives or personal information that people give. Is it going to use that in the learning such that when someone else somewhere else asks it a question, it's providing information that's related to something that you over here gave it, right? That might have been proprietary or personal. And do you think that's, I mean, that's going to be a problem? Is it a problem that you're aware of, or?
Um, well, for example, OpenAI would claim that it's not a problem now because it costs too much to train their model, and they're not going to waste their money on what every user puts in.
Yeah.
uh,
But that cost
any
will go to zero.
that cost will go to zero. But any serious company, and I've talked to a lot of them, they're interested in this, are building their own instances,
Right.
right? And they're using their own training data on their instance. Bloomberg was very public last year. They came out and half the training data they use on their system was proprietary data, right? And they're the only ones that with access to that instance.
Right.
So I think all these issues that the issues you just described and more have to be worked out, and the serious players need to think about that. But it's sort of like autonomous vehicles in the early days, and what I would say and I do say to large corporations, don't build something to scale next year. Build something to learn and really understand how what the most critical aspects of this technology are for the most critical aspects of your business and how it can make a difference to that. And you don't have to be first, right? It's actually better to let somebody else be first and mess up,
Yeah.
set the stage for you, right, to come along and say, hey, we're more thoughtful about it, and this is how our system does better. But I think you got to get in there, you got to play, you got to learn.
Yes. Discover. Um, do you think that this will push, uh, so it sounds like you, you've said that it's pushing some companies to private hosting of their own GPT engines, and there are a number of open source GPT, um, LLM type models and platforms out there now. Um, do you think it's just going to push the space more uh, into companies and people even doing that? Are we going to see sort of a growth in personal GPT LLM servers and homes, much like we had with personal computing versus mainframe or computing, so that people can protect and be assured that their information is protected? You think there's going to be a trend in that direction? I'm not trying to ask a leading question. It's just been a thought in my own
Yeah,
mind that it could happen, it could not happen. Have you any you see any sort of signals
I
or have
think
any thoughts on that?
I think it's really. Um, I think we're going to have a massive shakeout. And for example, most of the startups that 6 months ago were building on the uh, open AI platform using their APIs and their very platform tools to build, whether it's plugins or layers on top. Most of those companies are going to go away, right? Because that capability will get pulled into the platform,
Hmm.
in the same way that um, Mosaic doesn't exist anymore as an independent um, browser because the browser got pulled into the platform, right? Got pulled into the operating system. That's going to happen for most of the things we're seeing today.
Yeah.
So I think unless you're a Fortune 500 company with lots more capability, what you're doing right now is you're playing with this stuff. You're learning about this stuff in a way that one doesn't put your core assets at risk, and two um, doesn't tie yourself to some startup that probably won't exist in in 6 to 12 months or 18 months, or they would have been bought up by somebody else and you know essentially won't exist. What you're trying to do is we're trying to understand this technology in the context of your business, and assume that it's going to change really rapidly. Um, if for example you go to your cloud provider and just work on that, that's probably the safest thing because they're probably going to be, the equivalents of the Googles and Yahoos of the world that bought up everybody else, right, and pulled them inside their company. Um, but don't do anything mission critical and do a lot of playing around.
Yeah. Well, and maybe since you're maybe more on the optimistic side, as am I about technology, this is it might be a tougher question to answer. But I hear a lot about AI safety and that there's an existential risk. Elon Musk has said there's an existential risk to the human race. Um, and I haven't myself quite made the exact connection with what, and maybe I'm just dense. It's entirely possible. um, but I haven't quite seen the existential risk, like on the order of magnitude of like World War III, and some people, and maybe hyperbolically, have claimed exist with this technology. Do you know what that is, and what are these existential risks, and is it just hyperbole?
Well, I can't claim to know,
Yeah.
but I do. But when really smart people tell me there's something to worry about, I tend to pause and say maybe they're right, and not bet on it, but don't be humble enough not to say, oh, that's he's just going overboard.
Sure,
Um,
sure,
but there's nothing intelligent about a nuclear weapon, and it can kill us,
sure. Yeah.
right? So I think the existential risk of a super intelligent AI that we can't turn off, I don't see that. I mean, if if the neural network can't add yet, I'm not sure it can devise schemes behind our backs to kill us. Um, I don't preclude the possibility way down the road that maybe we'll get there. But what I worry about now is AI as a platform, as a tool that allows bad actors to do things that we don't want those bad actors to do.
Sure, sure.
Right. So, so safety. Um, some people would argue, and I would agree that we don't want Chat GPT to give me the recipe for creating a neural agent, right? Chemical weapon, right?
Sure,
It's in there
sure.
somewhere. I somehow that knowledge is in there because it was on the internet, or even to build
Oh, wow.
a nuclear weapon.
Yeah.
Right? So there's all this amplification possibility for bad actors to take advantage of these things. That I think is the first worry, and there's a lot of safety issues around that. So, if somebody tells me, "But you're impinging on my AI's right of free speech," or the user's right of free speech, well, as they say, your free speech stops at the edge of my nose, or something like that,
Right.
right? So I think there's a lot of safety concerns just at that level. What kind of information, what kind of knowledge are we unleashing? And do we want everyone to have access to that at no cost? I mean, sometimes the laws of zero come back to bite you.
Yeah.
Um, because in the past, you had to have a PhD in nuclear engineering in order to understand some of these things, or a PhD in biology. And we hope that most people who get to that, intellectual level are, are fairly good, good people. But now, if you just have to be um, evil enough to use a tool that will provide that knowledge, that I worry about. At the next level, I think there's lots of concerns around privacy. There's a lot of, I think the issues around biased data is real, right?
Mhm.
Especially when that biased data leads us to decisions that are either harmful or wrong. Um, whether that's um, tons of medical data about how a drug interacts with humans, but that all the data we're using to predict those interactions are only on men. So therefore, we don't know the impact on women.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we assume that, because we had such a large base of data on humans, and forget the fact that 80% of them were men, now we sort of made bad predictions and we do harmful things. I think there's that level of inadvertent danger that we have to be really careful about. And it's not just about political correctness; it's about real hard science.
Sure. Sure. And I
And then
think,
the other interaction I worry about is um, once back I was at the AI lab at MIT in my student days, and we built these systems and we worry about robots, planning robots, all that. But those robots never got to touch anything else.
right.
Right, you're in a closed environment, or even at a symbolic level, you're in a closed environment. Now you have this fairly general purpose platform, and you can start linking it to other things that take action. You know, I can probably link it to my door to unlock the door. Right, I can probably link it to my fire alarms to act in a certain way, my security system. I can link it to my calendar, my email. Somehow somebody could probably link it to my bank account. Right. So now you have the interconnection of these pieces, and we may not have a strong theory about the real world implications of those interconnections. So from a safety standpoint, somehow we have to have a formal theory about the interaction and have some kind of trust mechanism, right? To literally formally trust what the system is going to do, and we don't have any of that.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that you've touched on so many interesting things. I mean, I think there's AI that can be used to give people bad information that they're going to, or information that they'll use to go and do something bad, right? Like you said, the nuclear weapon development example. Some of that could have happened just with the internet, right? If the information was on the internet, they're going to just get it. The AI is just, it's almost like another browser for them in some way, but it's yeah, but I can definitely see that. I mean, and because you don't know, a neural network is a very nebulous black box of things, weighted network of things, and everything's encoded in a way that's not human readable and easily verified and validated. Right, that's one of the problems for its application to autonomous vehicles, in my opinion.
Yes,
uh,
absolutely.
um,
I agree.
but I think you're touching on the probably where I think the existential risk, and maybe that's where some others think of, exists when you connect it to robotics or something that can actuate the physical world, interface with the
Yes.
physical world in some way, and then yes, and so then my sort of safety, my robotic safety brain kicks in, and I say, well, yes, then that's where you need to have things like safety watchdogs, which are independently monitoring this arbitrarily complex system. It may be an autonomous driving system, it may be an AI driven thing. But this watchdog is sitting there monitoring. It's like the psychologist or the psychiatrist for this autonomous system over here, asking it, is everything okay? Or, and just making sure before anything bad happens, it can fail safe. So you need this ability to independently monitor and verify and validate, if you will, the safety of the outputs of the system,
Right.
so
Right.
that you can
Yes.
fail safe. In this case, you would prevent whatever it is that's actuating pressing the nuclear button, or or driving the car in the wrong way from doing that. It would apply the brakes and stop. And
Right.
and
And
yeah,
right. And in your world, you have a closed problem domain. You can sort of understand the edges of where that interaction might be.
yeah,
You know, you're not allowing your car to control the cars. You're not allowing them to coordinate. Hey, if the four of us crash that barrier at the same time, we can get through.
yeah,
Kind of thing. Um, so I was one of the people who were a little bit surprised that a few months into the game, OpenAI was saying, Oh yeah, we're putting an API in. Oh yeah, we're allowing it to sort of link it to other apps. Oh, we're putting an app store, right? Well, you know, you guys are still working on interpretability of your models, right? You still have you still have hundreds of red code teams sort of pounding into your systems to understand what you can say and can't say, and you're sort of maybe it's a little early to sort of like allow us to link it to the robot down the hall.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I agree. I mean, there's mistakes. These things definitely make mistakes. Just in looking at the image generating tools, I mean, there's the classic six fingers that get generated on the human being, and then you don't notice that until you're in the middle of your presentation.
Yes, I mean, I think I have to confess I've played with the image generators a lot because I just think they're marvelous.
Yes.
Right? It's just fascinating, for a wannabe painter to see what it can generate. But at the same time, I don't want to take it past fun,
Right.
right? But it is amazing for what it is, and it's the best artist and the worst artist in the room. I guess is another way of thinking about it. I mean, it's just really, if you think about the possibilities and where it's going, you just got to be amazed, right? It's the Arthur C. Clarke line, you know, any sufficiently advanced technology should be indistinguishable from magic, and I think these things are magical.
They seem like it. It definitely passes the Turing test a long time ago.
Yes.
Um, and and even the weird things it produces can be interesting, right? Sometimes there's something interesting that falls out of the unexpected
Yeah.
result that it produces.
Yeah. We just have to keep in mind that there's no common sense, there's no truth, there's no semantics. It doesn't really know, right? So if there's an edge case, you know, it doesn't know it's in it. And if it's one step removed from it, it doesn't know. And
Right.
that's where I think, a lot of work has to be done in terms of truth and fact and all that.
Yes. Yes. Well, I mean, yeah, it's the ethical and societal implications of all this are non-trivial, but and the interface with these robotics and autonomous vehicles and physical systems is is can will be even more problematic for sure until the verification of validation methodologies are fully sort of thought out and applied. I think so.
Yeah.
Well, just kind of pivoting for one second, you've talked about moonshots in some of your publications and just recently here. Um, what are some of the I guess moonshots that you find particularly exciting that are could you elaborate on maybe a couple of those that you think are are really intriguing to be thinking about maybe aside from generative AI?
Yeah, well, I think there are a whole host of healthcare issues
Hmm.
in terms of diseases that if we could address, the benefits would dwarf most of the things we just talked about. Um, so, when you talk to the experts in genomics, there are a lot of open questions. But what they essentially have is a more and more powerful experimentation platform for developing vaccines and therapeutics, for investigating various cancers. So there's a whole range of issues there that I think are really fascinating. When you look at single diseases like sickle cell that you can address, or various birth defects. But there are also moonshots that aren't really about advanced technology, but really about sort of changing the embedded system that we have. Um, so, for example, I do a lot of work these days with the American Medical Association, and one of the things they've spent a lot of money on over the last last 10 years is the simple problem of managing blood pressure. I say simple in the sense that we we know we know the issue. We have therapeutics. We know certain kinds of physical activity will improve, but yet still, you know, many tens of millions of people have high blood pressure, and that's the number one risk indicator for the number one disease killer, which is cardiovascular disease, heart
Hmm.
attacks, and strokes. So somehow the moonshot there is to put together the pieces that we already know and save, literally many billions of dollars and, you know, um, hundreds of thousands of lives each year.
Oh yeah.
So that those are we have a lot of problems from a societal standpoint where essentially we know the solution and we have to sort of develop the systems, scalable systems to address that. And their technology is will help us sort of make those easier. So, for example, um, when you go into your doctor's office for your annual checkup and they take your blood pressure, I'd be willing to bet they're taking it incorrectly. So for example, you're supposed to sit calmly and quietly for 5 minutes before you get your blood pressure taken. Have you ever had that happen?
Never happens.
You're supposed to not sit on the exam table with your feet dangling. Your feet are supposed to be on the ground. Um, and above all that, we all the evidence says that when we get our blood pressure taken in physicians' offices, it's almost heightened. Why?
Oh, yeah.
Because we're in these stupid little gowns and we're in a doctor's office,
Right.
right? So this number one sort of risk measure for the number one disease killer in the country, we actually measure the vital sign wrong, right? And on top of that, those home blood pressure devices that we can buy, which
Mhm.
work better, because at home you can actually follow the right protocol.
Right.
Your doctor doesn't have enough time or training to follow the right protocol. The majority of those on the market aren't independently validated for correctness.
Uh,
Um, so we can solve that problem. And now, we're going to have rings and cuffs and all that, and watches that can measure. So we can you can see a world in which we address that problem. Now, the next thing is we have to get that information to your doctor. So rather than having the wrong measure, she can have the right measure over time. And then we have to make sure for those people with high blood pressure, are prescribing the right therapeutics, the right pills, and making sure you take it, and then sort of nudging you when you're not. So we put all these systems together, and if we can reduce the blood pressure I don't forget how many millions, 80 million, 100 million, 120 million people with high blood pressure, we can dramatically reduce heart attacks and strokes. But the whole system is working against that.
yeah.
That's a moonshot that I think is within our reach if we can sort of work up the will to work on it as hard as we work on the driverless car problem.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's fascinating. I mean, yeah, definitely. I've always thought about that. I mean, yeah, there are 40,000 roughly people who die each year due to automotive accidents in the U.S. But but that's nothing compared to the number of fatalities due to heart disease and some of these other more serious
Yes.
matters
So the
affecting
future
health.
history of healthcare is one of the topics that we talk a lot about in our book,
Hmm.
about how changes not only in technology but in practice and the use of that technology can really sort of change the way we live, how long we live, and how healthy we can live.
Yes, yes. I guess I was thinking about because it's our train of thought was generative AI, and how it can help healthcare, um, and then what it what it could also do to have negative impacts for healthcare. But are you aware of any sort of generative AI applications where doctors are using it to co-pilot, so to speak, their diagnoses of people for basic basic illnesses and what have you, or
I think there's a lot of study and
Mhm.
hesitation
Yeah,
around that.
I can imagine.
Um, I think you hear a lot of stories about, for example, hey, I plugged in my symptoms. I went to 15 doctors, didn't get it right. I plugged in my symptoms, and it figured out, it gave me the right answer. Um, and I think what that indicates is that generative AI is really powerful for identifying those edge cases, right? That the normal physician might not encounter, and therefore, you have to somehow find a specialist who can decipher that kind of thing.
Hmm.
Um, but that's it's one of those situations where even if you can do that, do you want it doing everything else, and can you differentiate the edge case that it got right from all the cases it got wrong? Because it can't. So I think we will advance really in the same way that you're describing for autonomous vehicles, that we'll find those domains, right, where it can be really powerful, and be more aware of those domains where the human needs to watch it very carefully, or the human can do the work. Now that said, access to we have a massive physician shortage in the U.S. So many people can't get to any doctor, much less a specialist. So you can imagine a world where it's an initial triage, and then you sort of elevate in the right way. But we have to design the right service models for doing that. But the place where I think in the short term it can be really powerful is that, and I've been involved with folks who've done time motion studies of physicians. Physicians spend about 2/3 of their time in administrative tasks and less than a third with patients. And those administrative tasks are silly things like typing in the
Yeah.
notes from the day. If you really don't want to see the data about how many clicks it takes in the EHR systems for a physician to sort of get to actually doing productive work. Those administrative tasks are places where you can imagine a lot of the time might be freed for the physician to actually spend their time on actually the patient facing activities. Simple as automatic, intelligent transcription, right, of the session, so that not only does the physician not have to go back and recreate it and type it in at the end of the day, but can intelligently sort of summarize, capture, and make sure the right follow-ons are taken. Something as simple as what I was talking about before. Does the physician interacting with the patient for the first time in 6 months have the right information about its history, its uh, his or her history of blood pressure readings? What medications have been prescribed? You know, can you pull the record from the pharmacy about whether or not that patient's actually renewed his or her medication in the right sequence? Can you send the right notes to the care team to check up on that patient after a certain amount of time? Can that be automated? All that sort of glue in the process. I think AI can help a lot with.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I, what on what scale, um, it's sort of if you look at like I guess I don't know what the term is, human epics, um, or just is this AI development that has transpired more recently? AI has been around a while, but the more recent developments, is it on the scale of the mobile phone, the personal computer, the printing press, the first Homo sapiens to
Oh,
I mean, what scale is this? I mean, does it seems very big, and it seems like this is more significant than like the personal computer revolution.
you
It's
know,
more.
that's way beyond my pay grade to answer, but I'll say this. I think it's a direct consequence of the law of zero in computing, right? Because
Yeah,
all we've done, if I can say, all we've done is that we've had enough compute power, right, to cram every piece of data that has been on the internet from Wikipedia to all the Reddit things, cram that into the model as training data. I don't, the number I saw in the press was something like GPT-3, 300 billion in compute
Yeah.
time. Right. Of course, that's not the actual cost, right? Because it was direct from Microsoft. But the fact that we could actually train so many parameters on so much data comes directly from the fact that we have all that compute power and it's cost effective. I think that's a really big deal, right? In order to be able to synthesize that. So in a way, and the fact that it's a horizontal platform that knowledge can filter into so many different applications. It's certainly as big as the operating system, right? Is it as big as the phone? I think over time, you can't separate hardware from software. But this is a really big deal in terms of a a platform, right? A knowledge
Yeah.
platform for entrepreneurs like us to feed into specific domains, right? And to use that technology. So I think it's amazing. It's not intelligence, but it's an amazing tool.
Well, that's interesting because then when you start thinking about quantum computing and three-dimensional neural networks and things like that, it's going to accelerate even more dramatically.
Yeah, it's these things are built on top of each other,
Yeah.
which I think is the most fascinating thing. What kind of platform are we creating for new app development, right? So, back in the old days when I was in the AI group at Anderson and we were building, we had list machines and really advanced platforms to build these applications, but we were building from scratch. And now we have this knowledge base, right, of capability that we can tailor. Question is, how will we tailor it? How much power do we give to the platform provider? Who owns the profits? Who owns the economics? All those things. Who owns the data? All those things need to be sorted out. But it's an amazing platform for development.
What advice would you give to entrepreneurs and innovators to take all of this information in, like what's going on with GPT, with AI and quantum computing and what have you, all the developments? How do they take that and form a business around these things, or and any advice on sort of approaches, just sort of big picture steps to take?
Yeah, my the driving narrative of all my work sort of falls into two buckets. One is Alan Kay's aphorism, right? The best way to predict the future is to invent it.
Mhm.
So, in the context of what you care about, in context of what in context of what you're good at, what you aspire to, what kind of future do you want to build, right? That's the first question, uh, and it doesn't give you an answer, but it gives you sort of a framework for thinking about it. And the second sort of um, driving narrative comes down to 6 words from my standpoint: think big, start small, learn fast. Right. So at the level that you're talking about, the level we've been talking about, you want to have that really sort of large set of possibilities. Right. You, in strategy, it's all about sort of how wide your consideration set is,
Mhm.
and the things that you don't think about are the things that wind up killing you, or
Mhm.
that you wind up missing. So think really big. Right. Write your future history. Think about it in the context of what you really care about and your interaction with the world. It's not about doing everything. It's about sort of what you care about. And then it's really starting small, right? Not falling in love with that, not betting everything on that, but break it down to a scientific process of exploration and innovation, right? What's the piece that you can actually build? What are the big questions? How do you sort of
Mhm.
start the core and sort of work out? And really, it's over time. It's that learning process that gets you to some critical mass of knowledge, of assets, whatever that you can take. You can build, a robotics company built on a built on Tony, some platform, or you have some core skill that you want to bring to a particular company working on it, or you want to build a startup. right? But really, sort of at the core, the real sort of people who make a difference are people that have that deep passion and knowledge around some key topic.
No, that's great advice. People should. I'm going to write down those 6 words, and no, that's because it's hard. Definitely. I mean, I know when we first started a company back in 20 years ago, we were definitely thinking big, and I don't think we started small. started We thought big, and then we focused on that, but it took some iteration to figure out, well, we should really um, focus on smaller problems that people can use now, and then learn from that and build upon that. So
Yeah. Have you ever
I
seen?
wish you told me this 15, 10 years ago.
Well, we were in that car in California. You didn't ask. Uh, have you ever seen the video of Jeff Bezos giving a tour of his first office in his garage?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I've seen the desk that he had,
Right.
right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's. I mean, that is, of course, the think big, start small,
Yeah.
think fast sort
Hmm.
of Netflix. And all these great companies started off with a small core of people, right, with some passion around a particular idea, but digging really deep into it and sort of working their way outward. And unfortunately, the investment schemes, investment cycles, the payback times that we sort of have come to expect don't lend themselves to that. So this is really the work you have to do before you get into that.
Yeah, it can really skew the process. I agree. The investment um, cycles, what the investors might be interested in, right? To kind of put you in one direction versus the other, from what I've seen in other companies, right? So,
Yeah, and the reality is that what they're doing is they're optimizing their approach for their portfolio, right?
right,
Which means driving every individual piece to scale as fast as possible and then kicking them out as soon as possible,
right,
right? And that's it actually doesn't work for most venture capitalists, as you know, because most of them don't return
right.
their investors' money. But for the ones that do, it works really well. But if you look at the numbers, most entrepreneurs are not reaping the benefits, of the work. Sad.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I mean, and there's so much change happening at an accelerated rate. That media and how we get info is of course been changing dramatically. AI, quantum computing, we've talked about pandemics and newly discovered viruses, and then just the whole political structures and nations sort of conflict and all these things, and sometimes it can seem daunting
yes.
for people, right? Because there's like so many big things happening that are completely outside of your control.
Right.
And how can any thoughts on just any thoughts from you just on how people can find in their lives steer change to these to more positive ends and feel like we're advancing to a brighter, better future,
Yeah. So
with technology amplifying you know life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, whatever you
yeah.
want to call it, just amplifying the good things that we want in our lives.
Well, I think there are many reasons to be an optimist. I think the world is better usually than we tend to think. Based upon our negativity bias and negativity bias with the media. I mean, certainly there are a lot of bad things happening in the world, but there are a lot of good things happening as well. I mean, if you look at poverty, education, health. I mean, all those numbers do get better. So somehow we have to sort of hold on to that. But I think at an individual level, I think the thing we have to remember is that we have agency, right? Uh, you know, most of us, most folks who might stumble onto your podcast um, are living in the best times in the history of humanity, and they have a lot of agency. They have a lot of tools. That's not to say that there may not be hard part challenges as well. But we do have the opportunity to make a difference. Um, and within each of ourselves, I think we have to find that the germ of how we can make a difference and hold on to that optimism, right, in a
Hmm.
realistic, pragmatic way.
Yes. No. I couldn't agree more. But yeah, certainly there are days, right, for everybody where you're thinking, "Wow,
Oh yeah,
I just got to turn off the news," and of course, yes, the news and things like that, as you say. I mean, it can be inherently negative because there's a I mean, that's kind of how human beings, we have to react to the threats, not the good things. And so you don't hear as much about the good things, it seems, that are actually happening.
yeah. But you think about yourself, as a consumer, you have agency, right? Because you're voting with your wallet as a citizen. You're voting with your vote. As an employee, you get to choose within some range of where you work,
Hmm.
right? Some of us choose to choose on local issues, right? As an influencer, you get to um, sway people's opinions towards your point of view. So in each of those kind of dimensions, right, we have some level of agency um,
Hmm.
in terms of what we do, and the key is taking advantage of it in spite of everything else that's going on.
Excellent, excellent words of advice. So,
All right, so
so,
we can't close until I ask you.
oh, please, yeah.
So I want the big picture. The the rest of us look at your industry and say, "Oh, AVs, right? Who's going to win?" But every organization, right? Every attempt at it is like come they come from radically different approaches. They're building radically different tools. So you're not alike. You're not all alike, right? You're working on different problem domains.
Hmm.
How do you see things shaking out? Um, and how do you see sort of the differences in the approaches of the various players in the industry?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, I think of autonomous vehicles, ground vehicles, and what we're doing in terms of different broad application areas. There's automotive autonomy, like what Tesla's doing, driving anywhere on the public roads, going anywhere you want to go. What maybe the automotive manufacturers look to do. Then there's the robotaxi problem, where they've kind of boxed it in a little bit, but it's still within. It might be within the city of San Francisco or Austin and some area that's fairly complicated. Then there's sort of these sort of more custom shuttle applications that are just going really slow speeds and really, really hyper constrained situations. I mean, they're literally going 10 miles an hour, right? And maybe can't run on public roads. And then there's sort of um, these confined domains of operation where there's completely private or off-road operations, and then maybe confined operations still somewhat on public roads, like a residential community or a campus. And so I haven't quite categorized all of these, but I think of autonomy applications and opportunities in those broad domains, and then within those there are very specific applications, like for the defined operational design domain, as they refer to it, for fixed public zones of operation. There might be a transit application where you have buses and vans and what have you, or you may have a residential community. These might be smaller vehicles. They might be the shuttles, and so I come back to, I think it's really far out there for the automotive play. There's just going to be countless things to deal with. I think big trucks, the trucking applications have have some have a little bit further uh, to go, because it's a great application, but just one small thing goes wrong and you have a really bad accident,
Bad
right?
PR, right? Yeah.
And And then agriculture, I think it's, the margins are too tight. So you look at all these different industries, and I think logistics is a great application area and space where autonomy should just be taking off right now. For you know fixed, ports and yard truck yards and bus yards and things like that. And then I think downtown transit applications where it's just a circulator route of some sort, relatively simple to do. You can characterize what's going on in the environment, and because of these applications have fairly constrained geofenced areas, surface areas, you can put things in the infrastructure to help the application, that and it becomes economical versus what Tesla or the automotive company is going to do. They're not going to revamp the entire infrastructure of the United States or the world. But in these fixed transit applications, you can do things. That's the smart city type initiatives. You can add sensors at intersections
Yeah.
and have the vehicles communicate with that, and then you make those applications viable and practical. So I think all of those geofence applications are very doable now. I think there has been but then within that, there's been sort of there's been a couple of camps, but there's been, and we were involved with a company, Local Motors. Sadly, that's went out of business. Um, where they have these what we call bespoke autonomous shuttles. What we discovered along the way is you need special waivers to run them on public roads. They're 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 not necessarily designed for crash worthiness all the time, and they haven't been through all the rigors that some of just regular vehicles have been through. Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard compliant vehicles have been through, right? And so we just at one point said, well, we're an autonomy group, right? Like, um, so let's focus on the autonomy, and it should be vehicle agnostic, because you just got to pick the right vehicle for the job. And so I felt like that was a good application area where you can bring autonomy to practical use right away. There are other folks doing it. I think agriculture still, even though the margins are tight, is a great application area where autonomy is being put to good use
Mhm.
right now, and that will continue to grow, these logistics applications. But then with the caveat that each of these applications have that little thing that you didn't that some of them have these little thing that the little thing that you didn't know that the drivers were doing besides just driving, right? Like the
Right.
fixing the glad hands on the yard trucks, or helping people get on and off the bus and what have you. But I think you can bring enhanced safety to these vehicle platforms, because you have sensors all around the vehicle versus just what the driver can see.
Right.
You can see in conditions, night vision and what have you, that our human eyes can't see. You can check blind spots, and then you can communicate with things in the infrastructure in these fixed zones of operation, and that all be economical and viable, and the return on investment for the cities or the public or private organizations deploying this, it's economically viable now.
So uh, in that example, what do you look at as sort of the most promising places working to develop that? What cities are looking at, for example, downtown transit? And
Yeah, I think, well, the Jacksonville Transportation Authority down in Florida has had this vision for the ultimate urban circulator. That has always been, I thought, very forward thinking, with how they envision shuttles operating in and around the city, and replacing this um, raised platform shuttle service that they have now. Um, Houston Metro, we see stuff going on in Austin, Texas. I mean, there's just so many transit organizations that have been doing different things even up at the Philadelphia Navy Yard. There, there's an application up there. We know of Detroit, an application up there. So there's all these cities I think in transit organizations are really sort of pulling it together and starting to field these, but it's still at the 1 to 5 sort of autonomous vehicle level, right? And I think we're the tens and hundreds are really where the benefit comes, right, for the citizens. And but I don't want to leave without asking you one more question.
Okay.
As a futurist, what's your, and I think part of this was sort of captured in the book, but if you could just highlight what's the vision for the world in 2050 look like?
Oh, I mean, I think it's really pretty straightforward the way I conceptualize it. I want the world and the kinds of work that I do to change the world so that it's a better world for my daughter in 2050, right? Than it otherwise might be. In 2050, my daughter is going to be about the same age that I was when she was born. And I think there's a heck of a lot we as humans can do to turn the world into a better place, and to avoid some of the issues that we know we have. So that's what I hope for at a very, very high level.
Well, it's beautiful. Thank you so much, Chunka. I appreciate everything you've done, and appreciate you being on here and your work very much. So very honored that you would take the time to participate in this podcast.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much.
I hope you enjoyed the show Driven with me, Paul Perrone, your host. Don't forget to check us out at driven.show on the web, and give us a thumbs up or subscribe here if you like the show. Thank you for listening in. See you soon.